Hello. Thanks for coming. And yeah, we showed the movie last night. We did a Q&A at like 3 in the morning, so I'm going to do the best I can. How do we want to dive in, guys?
Should we let Josh get started, since he's the most involved in the ongoing appeal of this case? Do you want to just give us like a state of
where things are at?
Yeah.
So currently, hopefully everyone can hear me. Hello, everyone. We are right now in the process of preparing our reply brief to the government's brief in opposition to our appellate brief, and that we will be filing as of right now. It seems that it's going to be on August 1st. So, the purpose of that is basically just to respond to some of the points that the government raised in their opposition to our appellate brief. And certainly, I believe that we have the stronger position, and looking forward to, having the opportunity to respond to the government. And that's kind of where we're at right now.
I'm curious, just so I know how to start talking, how many people in here know much about this case? Does everybody know a lot about it? Is there any reason, should we just go give you a quick summary of what happened? Yeah, because we're kind of diving in all the way in the deep end, and for a lot of you probably will just have no idea what we're talking about. So, yeah, no, it's okay. The Silk Road was a market on the dark net. You probably have all heard of Silk Road. It was a robust community forum, anonymous users. It was a marketplace. It predominantly sold drugs in terms of the percentage of what was being moved around on it. In 2013, a young man from Texas named Ross Ulbricht was arrested in San Francisco and charged with being the Dread Pirate Roberts, who was he was accused of being the Dread Pirate Roberts, who was the primary controller, presumed controller of the Silk Road. Was extradited from San Francisco to New York, and went through a lengthy pre-trial process in New York, here in the Southern District, here in Manhattan, and went to trial in 2015. And in that trial was ultimately found guilty on all charges, which were primarily drug kingpin charges, hacking charges, that sort of thing. And it was a fairly contentious case. There was a lot of implications and questions around it in terms of how one would know exactly how you try a case based on anonymous users and encrypted technology, how you know what the evidence is, whether it's real, whether it's not. Bitcoin played a very big part in this story because the Silk Road used Bitcoin, and I would go a step further and say that the Silk Road actually kind of made Bitcoin happen, though I know a lot of people don't like it when people say that. They certainly popularized Bitcoin. So there's a lot of sort of cross-section implications, especially for this community. You're dealing with a trial that involved the drug war, it involved Bitcoin, financial regulation, and it involved cyber, and sort of that community, because it was a very politically oriented community on Silk Road. It wasn't what everyone was doing. It wasn't just political by any means, but there was a lot of that. So it was an interesting case. I got involved pretty early on, not as early as Andy. I'm going to let him speak for himself. And started making a movie about this right around when Ross was arrested, and was very, very entwined in the Silk Road community. I ended up with incredible access to the chief architects of Silk Road, who I'm still in contact with, and then people in law enforcement, and then people on Ross's family and on the defense team. So it certainly occupied the greater part of my life for several years, and kind of still does. You kind of can't get out once you get in. So those are the basic, I'd say, ground rule implications of what happened. And subsequent to Ross's sentence, he was sentenced to essentially a double life sentence without the possibility of parole, which they're currently appealing. It was a very intense, very extreme sentence. And there's been a lot of stuff that's come out since the trial. There were rogue agents that people have discovered that were were stealing Bitcoin and also manipulating the site and had full access to the site and the ability to manipulate things that were going on Silk Road. There's a lot of questions that haven't been answered. So the case is still very much of interest to a lot of people besides just the defense.
Having worked with Alex on his film Deep Web, I was attracted to Alex's approach in part because there has been this, I've been covering this case, the whole Silk Road story, since I guess 2011 when I first saw this kind of janky looking website that was offering psychedelic drugs for sale for Bitcoins, and it seemed like it must be a joke, but it was not a joke and grew into a massive black market. And then I interviewed the Dread Pirate Roberts through the Silk Road's anonymous messaging system in 2013, just before Ross Ulbricht was arrested and the site was seized. But it's been very weird for me as I felt like I was the reporter who was discovering this story, and then with Ross's arrest, it suddenly became this massive mainstream media phenomenon, and it was just their viewpoint on it was very different from the way that I saw it. I had been following the Dread Pirate Roberts as this almost like ideological political figure who was leading what he described as a movement of people on the dark web trying to carve out this libertarian free trade zone, more or less, where if we can't follow our really anarchist ideals in the real world, we can do it in this little bubble that we've created with cryptography. It was a crypto-anarchist experiment, as he described it. And then suddenly, when it was on the cover of Time magazine and Newsweek, it was like the dark web, how to keep your children safe from internet drug dealers. And Alex, I appreciate the fact that his film does acknowledge that the Silk Road was a political movement in addition to like a very lucrative scheme. Although I think it's always important to point out that there's no evidence that Ross Ulbricht enjoyed the millions of dollars in Bitcoins that he amassed as a result of running the Silk Road, that he lived this incredibly austere lifestyle and just kept the money in the digital equivalent of like a piggy bank they never touched. He was not living large on the profits from this. So I do continue to see Ross Ulbricht as a political figure. I think that that's something that has been lost in the mainstream story about this. But then the other things I think we wanted to talk about in this panel, the other kind of like deeper story of the Silk Road is first the massive corruption of the two agents who were involved in the Silk Road takedown. One from the Drug Enforcement Administration, Karl Mark Force, and one from the Secret Service, Sean Bridges, who both engaged in a kind of mercenary criminal behavior that I would say, in some ways, eclipses Ross Ulbricht's in the sense that they really were in it just for themselves. They had no political motives. They were stealing Bitcoins from the Silk Road. They were extorting money from Ross Ulbricht as they also tried to track him down. They, at the same time, were selling him information about the law enforcement investigation into the Silk Road, all under different pseudonyms that they had created. So when all of this came out and these guys were tried and then convicted and sentenced, it was an insane twist to this already unbelievably twisty story. And then I think I also just wanted to make sure we touch on the insanity as well of Ross's sentence, Ross's double life sentence, for what essentially are convictions on non-violent crimes. I mean, you've probably all heard about the murder for hire accusations in the trial, but those were not charged crimes. He actually faces charges in a different case altogether in Maryland for those murders for hire. That has not come to trial, and yet he was sentenced essentially for those violent crimes, although he wasn't convicted of them. So it's a maybe Josh can talk about how that works, but it continues to kind of I think it's like ever so slightly appalling that Ross Ulbricht, among many other thousands of people in the United States justice system, can be convicted of nonviolent crimes and then sentenced to life in prison. But in this case, it's especially troublesome because it does seem like there was a backdoor kind of trick used to essentially accuse him of murder without convicting him of it, and then sentence him based on those sort of non-charged crimes.
So I actually just want to touch on the government corruption that Alex mentioned and also Andy just mentioned. So that's one of our major points on appeal. And so with during the court, like while we were preparing for trial, I would say maybe I don't remember exactly the timeline, maybe 4 to 6 weeks before the trial, we like the defense team learned about this massive corruption of DEA agents that were very centrally involved in the investigation of the Silk Road. And we spent, I mean, I don't know, how many hours, but a lot of time litigating this issue in the court as to whether we would be able to, essentially let the jury know about this, astounding level of corruption. And, ultimately it was determined that, we weren't able to bring any of that out during the trial. I was just talking with Lynn, Ross's mother, before, who she's also giving a talk after this somewhere on this floor. I believe
Madison room, I believe.
5 o'clock down the hall.
Okay.
There you go.
And so I've spent the past week. I've been doing this like intense criminal defense like trial training program, and one of the things that they harp on is this notion of primacy and recency, that people tend to remember the first thing that they hear and the last thing that they hear. And so had the first thing that we've been able to tell the jury about been about to focus on the astounding level of corruption that was central to the government. I mean, it wasn't central to the government's case, but like the guys closest to this case that were conducting the investigation for law enforcement, had we been able to open on that, and had that been in the jury's mind during the course of the government presenting their evidence at trial, I truly believe that that would have made a difference. And so that's a major issue that we
Can you just
raised.
explain like how this came to be, that you were not allowed to talk about the fact that you knew some of the facts about these corrupt agents involved in the investigation, but were not allowed to mention them at trial? What was the government's justification for that?
So there was a investigation pending into this matter in another jurisdiction, and it was all being done under seal, and so the government said, oh well, we can't bring this stuff in because it's being this investigation is being conducted completely under seal, and that was essentially their argument to the court.
There were several events that occurred during the course of the case, even before trial, that kind of pointed to different types of malfeasance in the way that the case had been conducted. And there was a very big question which never got satisfied about how the Silk Road servers were accessed in the first place, which was never satisfactorily responded to. And I think that as an outsider, what was really apparent to me was the speed at which they really wanted to run this thing through the system. And and part of that, just to be really unbiased, is that the technology, the idea of trying to put a case before a jury that involves Bitcoin and encryption and the darknet and the deep web, and most people don't know what any of those things are, much less what the difference is between those things, and the implications of an anonymous community, and then you add the political element. I think it made their heads swim, and it was emblematic to me. This is something I dealt with on a much lighter note when I was researching the Napster story, which I was involved in from when Napster was in existence. Is when I first met those guys and started working on that story. Was the huge disconnect between the sort of institutional elements that were trying to break these systems and then the systems themselves. And there was such a huge disconnect in understanding on the institutional side, and that means government, corporations, law enforcement, and also largely the press. I mean, there was very little understanding. People, there are I could count almost on one hand people like Andy, another journalist, Patrick, who, maybe he's at a hacking collective somewhere where he disappeared, but who really understood these technologies deeply, and were also not only that, but then willing to write about it, because there was a lot of fear about really stepping forward and making certain claims about what the Silk Road was, whether you liked it or not. The party line was just, this is drugs, this is bad, we shut it down, the end. And some people in the media I talked to, I was talking about this earlier, said to me early on that to them it was Occam's razor. It was straightforward. It was exactly what it looked like. And knowing what I knew, because I'd gotten pretty inside the Silk Road by then, it was anything but Occam's razor. And as the story went on, it was just, you would learn that there was more things that weren't what they seemed, and more things that weren't what they seemed, and this was complicated, and this was needed to be given a bit more oversight than it was being given. And so sort of to be in the trial for me, and I was not there the whole time, but when I was there and then to be there in the sentencing, it was sort of like being kicked in the stomach, because you really felt like there was I'd been with the story for so long by then, and it just wasn't there. There was no representation in that courtroom. It's sort of, there was really not room given for it to be able to express what this thing was, that you could try to form a rational understanding of what actually happened. It just was moved through very quickly. They just tried to keep it very contained. As this is a drug thing, just look at it as a drug thing, the end, goodbye. And it was clearly just so much more to it. And so I wasn't exactly surprised by the rogue agents. I found out about them as the trial was unfolding through another source that I had, that this one major source, the one Andy mentioned, Force, who had been a very big part of the Silk Road Task Force out of Baltimore. It was becoming clearly evident that this guy was up to no good, and then the levels to which he was up to no good got more and more labyrinthine and go far beyond just stealing Bitcoin. And the direct engagement he had, even with inciting these murder for hires, and there were no murders. It was all sort of, basically like sting ops, and it was
and scammers.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's kind of scams, basically. And a lot of that had been manufactured by the rogue agents. So, the story just got more and more complicated, and the people that I knew inside the Silk Road were getting more and more outraged by what they saw, because it just wasn't what they knew had happened. And so it wasn't as if I sat there and went, I know what's going on, and damn it, no one will tell the truth. You didn't really know what was going on. It was really hard to have any indication of what actually concretely had happened. And I feel very unsatisfied at the possibility that I may never find out, no matter, I know a lot more than most people do, and more than we were able to put in the movie for legal reasons, but it was very, very frustrating. I can only imagine what it was like for you. So, and I won't put you on the spot by making you talk about that, but.
Well, it was really bizarre. I sat in every day of the trial, and it was just like kind of surreal to have had this impression that you had spent, was it 6 weeks, I think? Well, how long was the trial? A month.
Yeah,
3 weeks. Hearing all the facts about this case, and then after everything is over, you only then these indictments come out, and you learn that you guys had to sit on all this. Really,
I actually remember that I met up with you one time. We got lunch one day, and
was that before the
no, it was right after that stuff came out, and you were just I don't know how could you keep that a secret? How does it not come out? And
right.
I mean, obviously we were precluded from using it, but yeah, I mean,
well, the lead defense attorney, Joshua Draytell, on the case, I could see that he was kind of just boiling over with frustration as the trial went on, and that certainly helps to explain why. And he did call for a mistrial. How many times? 5 or 6?
A few times.
So we'll see where this appeal goes, but it does seem like there is an unusual amount of stuff that could be a foothold for an appeal. But I am not a lawyer. I have no idea. It seemed like in every step of the trial, the initial trial, the government just won every argument in the pretrial as well. There was this, as Alex mentioned, there was a controversy over how did the FBI find the Silk Road server, despite the fact that it was a Tor hidden service, and that wasn't a very interesting series of disclosures from them. They first said, oh, it was just a leaky CAPTCHA on the site that revealed its IP address,
right.
and that wasn't enough information, certainly. So
It was enough that nobody in the tech community bought it, but
it was like just a very weird explanation.
Yeah, so they, in connection with, we were raising a lot of questions about how, just like Andy said, obviously the Silk Road was hosted as a Tor hidden service, and, their explanation was, we discovered it through a leaky CAPTCHA, essentially. I was visiting, there was an FBI agent he's no longer with the FBI. His name is Chris Tarbell, and he submitted it's called a declaration along with the government's motions saying that this is how we discovered the Silk Road server. I went on the Silk Road. There was a CAPTCHA that you needed to type in. You needed to get through a CAPTCHA to get onto the Silk Road site, and so he went onto that CAPTCHA and typed in, a bunch of stuff, essentially like fuzzing type of, thing, and ultimately there were some packets that were spit back from the Silk Road server that contained the true IP address of this server that was hosted as a Tor hidden service. And as Andy mentioned, nobody in the tech world actually bought that. It was just like, well, that's ridiculous. So having actually looked at the configuration files from the servers themselves, and then the explanation that they gave was just, it wasn't credible, and that was, largely. So one of the things
and
that
you said as much in your response,
right?
And then their response to your saying that, well, this doesn't really make sense, was even better, which was just, okay, fine. So just let's say we did just hack the servers, okay? Let's just even if we did, that's not illegal, right? Because reasons, including the server is in a foreign country, and so we can do whatever we want. By the way, without with no warrants.
Yeah.
Which is a complete. This entire area of the law is very. It's shifting. There's new cases. I'm not going to get into other cases, but this, the government saying, yeah, we can hack into, this computer because it's located abroad. In the future, those things are going to be challenged. And
right. They didn't actually know where the server was because that's the whole idea of a Tor hidden service. So they said it's in a foreign country, so we can do what we want.
Yeah, it was a backwards argument.
But they can't have known that until they
exactly.
hacked it. So but then the argument that actually won the day for them was, well, how can this be a violation of Ross's Fourth Amendment rights if he's saying this isn't his server? So for him to actually have any privacy for the server, he has to admit that it's his.
Yeah.
So is this your server, Ross? Yes or no? And that essentially was the catch-22 that I think forced, better, but forced the defense to drop that line of
It was a little
defense.
chilling, again, from the outside, because it just felt, it was a very, very draconian way to play their hand, which is to say that, because you're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, and you're supposed to have rights. So, one of the things that I battled with while I was making the film, with various people, including certain members of the press, was that this was a rights. It wasn't wholly a rights-oriented story, but there was a very big rights component to this story, and that it was a precedent-setting case. And people would argue that it wasn't because you're dealing with drugs and other forms of contraband. And my counter-argument to that is that's exactly why it's precedent-setting, because it's exactly the type of case that the government would use to set precedent, because it isn't unassailable, because it isn't easy, because the whiff of crime will send most people away, and you won't get covered by a lot of the major media outlets, or they won't cover it thoroughly, and news cameras won't be down at the courthouse for Ross, and it's not the Aaron Swartz case. It's not, as easily and immediately unassailable. That's exactly the type of case you can set precedent on, because you can do whatever you want to do. You can slip it under the radar. The guy gets sentenced, and you're done. And the implications of that just get dismissed. And the notion of not granting the rights to, if the evidence, the primary evidence being used against this person was illegally obtained, well, the way the law works, then that renders that case and his case inadmissible. So that was very frustrating to watch from the outside. It was a sort of kind of labyrinthine logic they used to not allow that to get introduced, and it still has never been addressed. No one ever had to get on a stand during that trial and explain how they got to the servers. And you know, you guys are all in tech, so you get it. It's the same as somebody opening the door of your house, walking into your house, and stealing everything you have, and all of your files, and all of your medical records, and all of your photographs, and taking your kids and your blankets without a warrant. I mean, it's your whole life. So it matters, I think. And it's one of the frustrations that I've had of watching this case go down.
Can I just add one? Just this, I think was it 2 weeks ago? They're finally like.
Oh, the Microsoft thing?
Yeah, right. So,
yeah.
So this, I think that the Silk Road trial should have been a kind of precedent-setting trial, but I'm not sure that it did set any precedents because the government just got its way with everything.
Yeah.
Like
Well, it set the wrong precedent. But yeah.
Maybe, yeah.
The precedent's going to be set at the Second Circuit when they
Right.
go along with our arguments and our appeal brief.
Very possibly. But the precedent that has been set already now was this other ancillary case, which was one of the Silk Road staffers. Was his name Gary Winnick?
Davis. Right?
Yeah, sorry, Gary Davis, an Irish guy. So we've only recently learned, like, basically the FBI wanted, or the Department of Justice wanted Microsoft to cough up some emails from their Irish data center. Microsoft said that's in a foreign country, it's out of your jurisdiction, we're not going to give it to you, even with your search warrants. And they fought that, they lost, and they went to appeal, and now they just won. And we've only recently also learned that that was another Silk Road case, actually. That was Gary Davis, this Irish guy.
Yeah, very
and that
high
was
up moderator of Silk Road.
That was a precedent-setting thing that now we know that the Department of Justice, even with a search warrant, cannot take a foreigner's data out of even an American company's foreign subsidiary data center. So that's a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. It was that was a Silk Road related case, and they were eager to extradite him here.
I'm sorry, but I interrupted you saying something else.
No, back to the point of, like you mentioned about submitting this affidavit or not submitting. I mean, I'm not, commenting on any strategic, decisions that were made by the defense, but at least as it stands right now, the law in the Second Circuit, which is where, the Southern District of New York is, it's very bad for criminal defendants in any case involving, standing and Fourth Amendment issues. And, that's kind of the card that the government, got to play in this case. But, I think that's why it's so important for, people like myself and, other, committed defense attorneys to, push back on these types of issues because, just because that's the way it is today doesn't mean that that's the way it should be or will be, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And, it's kind of a call to arms for any other, defense attorneys that might be in this room listening to, just keep fighting.
Yeah, I mean, the case just hit such an extraordinary bullseye of various modern issues that hadn't usually been all wrapped up in one case. So there's a lot here worth studying, from those, even if you're interested in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, just the implications here regarding Bitcoin were strong, the implications regarding the punitive nature, with which the government is dealing with cyber-related cases right now, and the level of fear and the desire to sort of wrap them up neatly and quickly. Forrest was clear in her sentencing that she was making an example out of Ross, and that was one of the reasons for the harsh sentence, was not just for what she felt he had done, but what she felt other people were doing or may do down the road. So that was kind of stunning thing to hear admitted, even though that's what we all assumed she was thinking. So I mean, there is a lot of fear. I mean, there's a lot of cultural, institutional fear around technology, where it's going, what the power of it is, and it's not a black and white thing. As I was doing the film, I met a lot of really amazing people in law enforcement who very much disagreed with the notion of complete transparency and being able to break into everybody's technology, and felt very strongly that the more the internet gets weakened, then the more vulnerable citizens become, which of course is pretty accurate from a technological standpoint, but not really understood, I don't think, by a lot of people in sort of the institutional community. So So the case really strikes at the heart of a lot of that, and I think we'll be seeing a lot more of that type of thing as time goes on now. And I think it's really the beginning of something and not the end of something. I think we're going to begin to see a lot more of this type of action. I agree with Josh. It's like it's really important to see people get up and fight these cases and try to get at least as much nuance and clarity into them as possible, whatever side you fall on. I have to say, personally, I was pretty down the middle until the sentencing. The sentencing it was really hard for me to sit there and stay unbiased. Thankfully, we literally aired the day of the sentencing, which was just crazy timing. And I remember saying to my network, it's a good thing we did, because had we not, I would have recut the whole movie and made it just a flat out piece of advocacy, which wouldn't have been a good thing. And that really wasn't how I felt until the sentencing was just so completely extreme, and her language was so political and damning, and it just seemed so, not, especially considering it's in federal system, it's life without parole. So it's, that's that until you go through appeal, and obviously, they're going to continue fighting until they get him out. But it was I was very unprepared, and I have to say, being in the courtroom around people who were of all stripes, because I was there with other journalist friends of mine, some of whom were very anti-Silk Road, and they don't have any sympathies towards it at all. But there wasn't anyone in the room on the day of the sentencing that wasn't very stunned by the sentence and by the language that was used in the sentence.
I think even the prosecution had not.
Yeah, they hadn't asked for anything that extreme.
Sentence. They had asked for something. I think they said
30 years, maybe.
I think the language they said was just significantly beyond the mandatory minimum.
Yeah,
right. Which was 20 years. What was the mandatory minimum?
20 years.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Just on the notion of sentencing, there's, a few. It's basically there are a few words that you should there are all these rules, there's set forth in statutes, and that kind of guide how a judge is supposed to sentence. And the key words are sufficient but not greater than necessary.
The thing that kind of struck me as unjust about the sentencing was this explicit deterrence effect that Judge Forrest was trying to, that she actually said, I'm not just sentencing you to life because of your actions, but because you have started something new. This, your legacy is that you've shown people how to do this, and I have to prevent future people from doing it. And that, first of all, deterrence with harsh sentences doesn't work. I think we know from studies, but also it hasn't worked in this case. The dark web drug markets are an order of magnitude bigger at this point. The Silk Road was the first of its kind in a way, and then there are now more than a dozen of these markets. I don't remember what the revenue numbers for the Silk Road were, but a study a year ago, and it's only grown since then, said that there's $100 million of revenue moving through these markets at least a year. So, and another thing to note is that these new markets have none of the political ideals of the Silk Road. Even if you disagree with what the Silk Road was trying to do, it had ideals, and you couldn't buy stolen goods. You couldn't buy even stolen credit card information.
Child pornography.
They couldn't. They didn't.
Like that.
They sold guns for a little while, but then they stopped. The sites that have taken over, there's Evolution now, Alpha Bay, are actually run by real cyber criminals who have none of those ethics. They just function as cyber criminal marketplaces with tons of the fruits of data breaches just being sold on a daily basis, with none of this kind of ethos of only victimless crime that the Silk Road tried to instill in people. So it's I don't know, kind of reminds me of The Wire, when you take out one drug kingpin and he's just replaced with someone far nastier, and there's this the dark web just gets darker with this attempt at deterrence.
I just talking about the sentencing in the abstract is really it's not the sentencing. It's sentencing of a human being, of a person, and honestly, the thing for me that really kind of drives it home is like seeing Ross's mother. You know, today I haven't seen her in a while, but you know, that's this is the, and you know, this happens to people in criminal, you know, federal criminal cases across the country every single day. I mean, people's lives are completely destroyed by this system. And, you know, I mean, I think it's like this case, you know, I hope calls some attention to, and it does. I mean, I think obviously people are aware of, you know, the implication, like just the impact of this sentence on, you know, Ross's family and, you know, on Ross himself. You know, I mean, everyone kind of talked about their initial involvement in this case, like Andy covering the case as a journalist, or Alex, you know, making the movie. You know, my initial involvement in the case was, you know, the first time that I went to MDC Federal Prison, which is located in Brooklyn, you know, to meet Ross. And, you know, my initial impression of him was, like, had I met this guy on the outside, like, this is a guy that I would, like, hang out and drink a beer with, probably. Like, he's, you know, and it's just, yeah, I mean, this happens. It happens a lot in, you know, many cases, and, you know, I as I said, I just think, you know, it's. I don't know. I hope that there will be some, you know, some reform in how, you know, criminal justice is meted out in this country.
Should we take questions?
Yeah, should we open it to
Yeah, you guys
questions?
want to, do you have any questions?
I'm not gonna, you know, get into any thing related to that, but I do appreciate your question, though.
Yeah, so there's a number of cases that have been coming up since the 90s, and I'm sure it happens in other areas as well, where you have evidence that's of an extraordinary technical nature, and you have a jury deciding what the outcome of that evidence should be. And there's, so far as I know, there's no process of ensuring that someone on that jury has some idea of what the implication of that evidence is, right, or of vetting it. And so I'm just wondering, apart from experts that are, and I can hear you. Excuse me, sorry, I was being interrupted. So I'm just wondering, what, as a defense attorney, are you able to do to ensure that the jury is properly educated about this, apart from having experts just in the courtroom?
Yeah.
Because that's also very politicized, right?
Sure.
Like you have the defendants and the plaintiffs, experts, they come in, and it's whoever the jury decides to trust.
I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges that we run into in, you know, I mean, you know, frankly, like, I've given talks to groups of criminal defense lawyers. Like, you could spend like months and months and months talking about this, but you know, it's a huge challenge in, you know, litigating any, you know, technically complex case. And, you know, I mean, you can't necessarily ensure that anyone on your jury is going to you're going to end up with, you know, a single technical person. And
They work hard to prevent that, don't they, on the other side?
I mean, there's no.
I didn't see any lights going on in anyone's eyes on that jury when they were talking about Bitcoin. This is definitely.
Yeah, I mean, there's a million different factors that, you know, are at play. It's like, okay, well, this one person is a technical juror, you know, are they with us, are they against us, you know, how do we want to present this information to them? There's no simple answer to that question, basically. But I think, you know, in terms of helping jurors understand, I mean, you just want to kind of break things down into, you know, some BYTE size pieces that, you know, they'll be able to digest. And, you know, you may want to do that through experts or, Yeah, it's a complex question though, but it certainly, I appreciate the, I guess, the gravity of that question.
It felt, again, as an observer, that what was really missing on the Silk Road case was a willingness on the part of the judge to allow there to be communication to the jury as to how this stuff worked. Because I don't think that you can make the presumption that people will understand this stuff, especially in a case like Silk Road, which is genuinely complicated, that the jury will understand it. And it's really incumbent upon the court to make sure that the jury has gotten enough information in hand to have a grasp of what happened to the best of anyone's ability before they come to any kind of conclusion. I'm speaking as the non-lawyer here. So,
I was just going to say, there was a lot of really powerful evidence against Ross in the case. Like, I think we just have to admit that they did seize his laptop with a ton of stuff on it. But there was also Tor and Bitcoin and PGP involved, and like those things had to be explained to the jurors, and they had to get a crash course in like 3 days on all that stuff, as well as all the facts of the case, and they came to a conclusion in like 3.5 hours, which was just a little like disturbingly fast for a case this complex. So you got the impression that like with that short a time frame, they probably were thinking a little more about like the murder accusations than they were about the chain of custody of the logs that had been
and I think had they had the opportunity to hear some semblance of the again astounding level of government corruption involved in this investigation, I think things would have turned out differently, could have turned out differently.
yeah, and I just think that given the gravity of the issue that I had was regardless of the preponderance of evidence, given the gravity of the potential sentencing, I just felt it was you're dealing with a human life, as Josh said. So, it really requires the clarity of explaining to that jury what the full level of the machinations of how the Silk Road worked and how Bitcoin works and how encryption works and what they genuinely did and didn't know. Because otherwise, which of course is the aim of the prosecution, rightfully for the prosecution because that's their job, it just gets boiled down to this hyper-simplistic thing. And if you sentence someone on that and you're talking about their entire life without the possibility of parole, then that's what's questionable. So that was what felt frustrating to me, just personally, was, okay, fine, let's just say for the sake of argument, which is actually not what I believe, but let's just say for the sake of argument that all these charges were completely valid. All right, well, let's find a sentence for that that's commensurate with that. But I don't feel that's actually what happened. And that, I think, was largely due to the fact that nobody on that jury had any idea what anybody was talking about most of the time. And it got boiled down to this extremely hyper-generalized idea, and then he was sentenced on that idea. And because of the severity of the sentence, that I felt was a problem.
I think looks like we have a few people lined
Okay.
up, so
Yep.
next
No, it's
question.
just such a good question. Anyway.
Mine's just a simple question. From the movie, was he actually arrested in the Bay Area in California? And if
Yeah.
so, why was he tried in New York? Was he a resident of New York, or I'm wondering how they made that distinction?
Well, I'll let the lawyer answer that.
So one of the, this is a tough question to answer. There are several ways to answer it. I think, so in a criminal prosecution, you need to, as the government needs to establish venue, meaning that, there's some connection between, the jurisdiction in which the case is being tried and, the charged crimes. It's actually a pretty, a major, I think, an important issue in a lot of cybercrime prosecutions. But, I'm not going to, I suppose, get into all that. But, arguably, it didn't come from me, but I heard, I think that the Southern District of New York Prosecutor's Office, they like to prosecute, big cases here. And I think also the FBI cyber squad that's located, they have like a major presence here in New York City. They have a huge office at the top of, I don't know if it's at the top, but wherever, in 26 Federal Plaza. they have a lot of agents there, and so they have a lot of resources here that they may. I mean, I don't know what the U.S. Attorney's Office out in San Francisco looks like in terms of their resources for investigating and prosecuting cybercrime cases here, but having worked on this case and several other cybercrime cases prosecuted in the Southern District of New York, they have a major presence here.
But it seems like
such a high-profile case that probably, I'm sure, had a lot to do with it.
It
in
seems like
tracking
the thing is that the internet is in New York and it's in the Bay Area and it's everywhere, so they get to choose where to prosecute someone when for something like the Silk Road that is like a that has users, buyers, sellers all over the place, and so it was just like the New York prosecutors were the most ambitious about policing the internet, and in this case and in others, so that's why it happened here, right?
Thank you.
You don't know how they found the server in Iceland and the server in some other country, but how do they find the Bernal Heights Public Library? Do you know that?
You mean when they arrested Ross
Yes.
Ulbricht in the library?
How do they find him there?
How do they know to go there?
Well, working backwards, they established like physical surveillance of him and were watching him on the grounds.
They'd already identified
Oh,
him.
yeah.
Right.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
they were preparing
He was a person of interest because of the ID issue, or?
no.
And so there was
It actually
a whole
wasn't
chain
those.
of events. I think that actually began with an IRS agent named Gary Alford
Exactly.
doing a Google search that led to some
It wasn't the
OPSEC
IDs.
mistakes that gave them Ross Ulbricht's name. Then they got like a pen. I mean, I'm gonna screw this up. Apologies, but they got a pen register for his Gmail account and stuff, and then eventually that led to them with a guy on the ground following him with binoculars or whatever, and seeing him go into a cafe. The cafe's busy. He goes into the library. They set up a sting. They are able to grab his computer before he can close it and encrypt it.
Got it.
That whole thing.
And
Yeah.
you failed to get delays in this process because most federal trials take place in years.
Did you say?
You,
Failed.
the defense, failed to get delays in the trial to allow the other proceedings to stretch out and be adjudicated?
I'll just say that as a general matter, in federal criminal trials, when I think contrary to, you said that sometimes these cases go on for years. That's not typically, the way that it works in federal criminal prosecutions. I mean, they set a date for trial and, you're going to trial on that date, so you better be ready.
Okay. And they didn't use the MLAT for the Irish guy? Why didn't they do that instead of going after Microsoft, a U.S. corporation?
I can't speculate about that. I don't know.
Okay.
I think that they just don't want to use an MLAT because it's slow and hard.
Yeah.
So they were like, let's
Same
do
thing
this.
with the Iceland server. It was also the same issue with
And
the MLAT.
right, they did use an MLAT for
Yeah.
the Silk Road server.
maybe,
But for the
yeah.
Irish guy, they didn't, and they're trying to just like they're trying to get precedent to do this the easy way, the easier way, and they lost. So now the result is that they have to get an MLAT, which is a mutual legal assistance treaty,
Yeah.
meaning like work with the actual government that has jurisdiction over that server, and that can be very slow, and that's why they didn't want to have to do that.
Hi, Oz Sultan. I'm with Techonomy and
Sounds like,
Independent Journal Review.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. My apologies.
Hi, Oz. I'm with Techonomy and Independent Journal Review. Great panel. I've been following this for some time. I had a couple of questions. The first being the Oracle case in California had a lot of precedent-setting work in terms of actually getting Levity to explain things to jurors. Was that something that factored in terms of just case material that you used here? And secondarily, do you think that this was a case of jury nullification?
So the first, if I understand your first question correctly, it's so the Oracle. Are you talking about like the
Well,
Oracle?
I'm just talking about the depth to which you're going to have to explain some of these issues. I mean, they literally took the jurors out and they took the judge out for 3 to 5 hours just to explain JavaScript to them, right? And what I'm hearing, or what I'm hearing from a lot of the reporting of this, is that things like Bitcoin, very complicated technical issues, weren't necessarily covered to the best of ability in explaining them to the jurors. Is that correct to assume?
That. I'm sorry. You said.
Is it relatively correct to assume that the technical explanations weren't sufficient for the jurors?
I wouldn't say that. I think that, you know, let me take a step back from that. So one of the issues that we're raising on appeal, we had two defense experts that we, wanted to put on. One explaining Bitcoin, and especially in the context of some of the testimony that the government was permitted to put on, with an expert that they, hired in the middle of the trial to conduct this complex Bitcoin forensic analysis. And, we were essentially like, I would say maybe 24 hours before that, given notice that this person was going to be testifying and received thousands of pages of spreadsheet information about they did a pretty complex analysis of Bitcoin forensics. Anyway, we were precluded from putting on either one of the experts that we, intended to call. And so, in that context, I think that the explanation that we were able to provide to the jury was insufficient, because we were not able to call the experts that we wanted to.
And this is obviously conjecture, but do you think it was a case of jury nullification?
Jury nullification is typically where, a jury, they hear, all of the evidence in a case and they say, okay, well, we're just going to acquit no matter what. It didn't happen here, so it's not
Not relevant.
case for where nullification, took
to wind down
effect.
soon, right? Should we take one more?
I know it seems like Lynn had a comment she wanted to raise.
It's just a point. I just want to say, no, they did not have an MLAT.
Oh, it's this one.
They did not have an MLAT. They lied about having an MLAT to different magistrate courts. And then in a footnote, which apparently I'm told by our lawyer they do this, footnote, whoops, sorry, we were wrong about that MLAT. This is in September, oh gosh, it's in a footnote. I think it's in September of 14. Not positive. But anyway, no, they did not have an MLAT, and they lied about having an MLAT so they could get warrants.
I guess I missed that, so thanks, Len.
Okay.
So it sounds like some of their evidence, they lied about pieces of it. How is it, shouldn't that get the evidence thrown out or get them hit up for perjury?
Yes, it should.
Next.
We know that they. It seems like they, at the very least, obscured the truth about how they got the evidence. I'm not sure we can say that we know that they faked any evidence.
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean it's not pretty sketchy.
Do you think that the Silk Road is going to, or websites like it, are going to end the drugs war, or as Graham Hancock calls it, the war on consciousness?
There's no doubt that over the next 10, 20 years, there will be more and more drug-related sites. They will eventually become regulated, and it will eventually have some impact on the drug war, which is waning and going to have to get phased out anyway. I think most people in law enforcement know that its days are numbered. So I think, yes. I think we will see, there'll be very different types of services, and some of them will just be straight-up regulated drug services, but drugs on the internet will absolutely be a fundamental part of our future.
We have to cut it off now.
Thanks, you
sorry,
guys.
But
Thank you.
These panelists will be outside if you want to talk to them outside the room. If you can catch them, see them walking around the conference. And